Hey guys, Nike here, and today I'd like to talk about one of the hottest topics in the Guild Wars 2 community, and that's AFK farming. If you aren't aware, and I don't blame you for not being aware, you can park a character with minions or NG turrets in certain places where mobs spawn, and it will kill all the mobs, and slowly but surely you will acquire material drops and a negligible amount of gold. ANET hasn't commented officially on it and appears not willing to be taking any action on it since technically the AFK farmers aren't violating any terms of service. From my point of view, there are three camps of opinion on this issue. The first is people that think AFK farming is literally killing the game by driving away new players in vast numbers while also destroying the economy into an unplayable state. The second group are people who think it is a bad look for the game to not take any action on it, but it's more or less negligible economically. The third group of people are people who don't care and enjoy chaos, so they stoke the debate by making Reddit posts pretending to be Russian bot lords that control vast resources gained from a huge number of alt accounts doing AFK farming. Let's cut through the BS and discuss the situation and see what we can conclude. Pack a lunch, because this will be a long one. I will preface everything I say by explaining my position up front so you can understand my biases. I fall into the second camp. It does, in my opinion, look crappy to see AFK bots farming in the game, and I could see how it discourages some players from playing. But I don't think it drives away a significant amount of players, and I don't believe it negatively affects the economy in almost any meaningful way. Let's start off with the appearance factor. It's definitely a bad look for the game to have a significant presence of AFK bots. It gives the impression that the game is poorly moderated and that the economy is rigged against regular players, whether that's correct or not. This is a credible complaint, and if ANET decided to take action against the AFK farmers for this reason, in my opinion, they would be 100% justified doing so along these lines. The complaint that I do not find credible is the idea that vast amounts of new players see the AFK farmers and then go on to quit the game immediately in significant numbers. First, one only need watch the live streams of new players learning the game to see that new players do not understand almost anything they see in the game. So on the rather off chance that they encounter a cluster of these farmers, it's highly unlikely they will even understand what they are looking at, especially if they aren't MMO veterans who know to look for these sort of things. Secondly, I believe that AFK farmers are not commonly enough found for players running into them to be a regular occurrence during any normal gameplay loop, whether that be a new player leveling experience or any endgame veteran gameplay loop. So the chances of a new player seeing them often enough to have a strong opinion on them seems very unlikely. As a result, I find the claim that any significant amount of players quit the game over it very specious. Before anyone chimes in with a personal anecdote about their 100 close friends who all instantly quit the game the second they saw an AFK farmer, please spare me. I don't believe in highly self-serving anecdotes, nor would I be convinced with them even if there was somehow a good reason to believe anyone's individual anecdote. In conclusion, ANET can and likely should take action against the AFK farmers in order to improve the overall perception of the game. But that said, it's not a critical issue, relatively speaking. If we are going to discuss things that cause people to quit the game early on, or things that cause negative perceptions of the game within the larger MMO community, the list would be very long, and nobody could honestly say that AFK farmers are even in the top 10 of reasons. So ANET does, after all, have way bigger fish to fry. But let's move on to the economy, which is a far bigger reason that this is brought up, and a much bigger issue to untangle. A lot of words have been said about the economic scourge that AFK farming is, but almost none of it holds up to any sort of scrutiny or close criticism. The main argument goes as follows. AFK farmers bring in vast amounts of materials into the economy. The large influx of materials lowers the sell price of materials across the game. This reduces the income of players primarily new players who play almost exclusively open world and whose income is mainly materials. And thus, it damages the game's economy by driving up the cost of things they want to buy in real terms. I will discuss each of these points in turn. First up, scale. Do AFK farmers bring in vast amounts of materials into the economy? I find that this claim is often made, but is not based on any sort of analysis or any sort of viable estimations. Near as we can tell, an AFK farmer in a good location can generate about 3 gold worth of materials per hour. In 24 hours, that means they create about 70 gold of value, which is a pretty decent sum. Let's say across Tyria, both on NA and EU combined, there are 500 AFK bots, which I feel is a very generous number, but probably not far from accurate. In order to be extra conservative, let's double it to 1,000 bots. This means, on a daily basis, AFK farmers would add roughly 70,000 gold worth of materials to the economy. This does sound like a large number, but is it? Let's compare it to the Octavine. The Octavine is a popular HOT meta event that fires every 2 hours and is well attended due to the generous rewards. All told, the Octavine creates about 7 gold per player per event of reward. Each instance of Auric Basin holds 150 players. Even on off hours on NA, there will be at least 2 instances full of players doing the Octavine. Let's say that across EU and NA combined, on average, there are 5 instances going. Often more, but let's just say 5 for the sake of being conservative. This is 750 players. Like I said, the number is likely far higher on average, but even 750 players would generate 5,250 gold per event. Multiplied by 12 Octavines per day, we can estimate that the Tyria meta adds roughly 60,000 gold to the economy each day. Then, it is fair to conclude that the AFK farming is roughly as impactful as a popular meta event. Is this bad? I would argue not particularly in the grand scheme of things. Octavine is, after all, just one meta event. There are literally several dozen other meta events that fire in equal numbers throughout the day, roughly every 15 minutes, and they add their own share of loot to the economy. When compared to the size of the entire economy, 70,000 gold worth of materials per day is a drop in the bucket. My very rough guess is that across the entire game economy, several million gold of materials are introduced to the economy daily. 70,000 out of several million is not a figure that anyone could claim could sway the overall direction of the economy. Even if we lowball and assume the economy only generates 3 million gold of materials per day, and let's say we highball the impact of AFK farming to 100,000 gold, this is still just 3% of the game's GDP, which is to say largely irrelevant as other macroeconomic factors, namely demand, are far more impactful. In conclusion to the first point, I do feel it's safe to conclude that overall the macro impact of AFK farming is negligible, that on the absolute highest end of estimates, it accounts for 3% of the game's GDP, and that figure is almost certainly far too high. The second point is that the influx of materials from AFK farming lowers the prices of materials in-game. This is partly correct and obvious that more supply equals lower prices. Obviously, any new materials entering the market for sale lowers the prices. However, there's a very strong reason to believe that AFK farming has a minimal effect on the greater market and the total basket of materials. First, as outlined above, AFK farming is a minor economic factor. Therefore, its potential impact on the overall economy is also small. That said, AFK farmers aren't farming all the items in the game in equal number. They are farming specific items, and it does appear that their activity in certain niches is impactful. For example, many AFK farmers target expensive and tricky to farm T3 and Tier 4 materials like totems that are used to make legendaries and that endgame players don't have a good way to farm. They do not farm things like ectoplasms. Yet the price of ectoplasms continues to fall. It stands to reason, therefore, that the price of ectoplasms falling and other materials that the AFK farmers aren't farming is not linked to the AFK farmers, which gives us strong reason to suspect that there are other market forces acting on the price of materials. However, the AFK farmers have in fact introduced ways to generate these somewhat niche items like T3 and T4 totems into the economy much faster than before. This does have an impact on specific items. That said, does the availability of slightly more abundant T4 totems lower the price of materials in general? That is a very difficult statement to prove, and in fact, I would argue the opposite is true. Mid-tier fine materials like totems are used primarily in legendary crafting. That is their main and likely only sink. Legendaries require materials in such variety that they are largely immune to any single ingredient price drop affecting the total price. Why is that? The answer is that for every player who is enticed to enter the legendary market because totems are cheaper, it creates a corresponding demand for every other legendary crafting material, especially ones that may not be target farmable. This drives the price of all the other materials in the legendary basket up. Thus, if we take our example to an extreme, if T4 totems ever dropped down to vendor prices, it wouldn't affect the overall price of the legendary because other items that present a bottleneck in legendary creation would rise in price corresponding to the decline in totems. How do I know this is true? Simply put, if the total price of legendaries drop, more buyers enter the market. When buyers enter the market, prices rise. Thus, legendaries will always reach a price equilibrium where they are created at roughly the same rate that they are consumed. The rate that they are consumed does in fact decline over time, which is why the price of materials are dropping, not because of the supply of the materials, which is why it's incumbent upon ANET to create more and more legendary items or variant skins to maintain this economic function. However, this tangent has nothing to do with AFK farming, so let's move on. The third point is the most specious of all, in my opinion. The claim that certain players, namely new players and players who are mainly open world PvE players, are unfairly impacted by lower material prices as a result of the AFK farmers. This point is the easiest to dismantle, and it falls apart from scrutiny from several angles. I'll address as many as I can. First, as I've demonstrated, it's unlikely that the drop of materials as a whole is tied directly to AFK farmers. And the fact that material sinks that ANETs add, or doesn't add in this case, is in fact the key determinator of material prices. So the premise is flawed that AFK farmers are lowering the price of materials across the board and can be rejected out of hand. Simply put, demand for legendaries is what drives the prices of most materials. And when the demand of legendaries goes down, the price of materials will decline. And AFK farmers, relatively speaking, are a significantly smaller factor in the overall price of legendaries, which is what the entire market in Guild Wars 2 is based on. But let's dissect it further to address people's concerns more holistically. From a macroeconomic point of view, it's important to remember that my spending is your income and your spending is my income. For every seller, there is a buyer and vice versa. If a seller is, for some reason, compelled to sell a material at a lower price than the market history and is quote-unquote hurt by that, there is a buyer who is able to buy material at a historically low price who benefits equally but opposite. This is a net neutral economic change. This is not, in and of itself, damaging to the economy on any way. Proof of this is that the economy in the game still functions. Prices are mostly stable on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, and the economy continues to circulate well. If material prices were in fact actually in a free fall and we entered a deflationary spiral, no one would spend their gold on, say, T6 blood today when they could wait until tomorrow and get a better deal, or wait another day after that and get a better deal, and so on and so forth forever, to where no one spends any gold and prices continue to crash till vendor prices. The economy would crash rapidly as all the materials did approach the vendor price, but this isn't happening. There is no deflationary death spiral in the game, so the only thing we conclude is that a slow and slight drop in price isn't actually causing economic gridlock. Why that is tied to the next point. Nobody in the game is exclusively a buyer or exclusively a seller. There are not two camps of players. There's not one camp of players called sellers who their main economic function in the game is selling and they're hurt by material prices dropping, and then another camp of players whose main economic function is buying and they benefit outrageously. On the average, it's a mathematical reality that it's mostly 50-50. Half the time you're the buyer and half the time you're the seller. Some players may be slightly skewed towards one side or the other at different times in different areas. But overall, the player base is comprised of both sellers and buyers in equal numbers at all times. The idea that sellers are hurt while buyers benefit is an asinine concept when you realize that all players are buyers and all players are sellers. There are no separate camps made entirely of buyers and another entirely of sellers. We are all both buyers and sellers in equal measure. So since we are equally buyers and equally sellers, and the effect of the price changes is net neutral, how can anyone be hurt? Simply put, they cannot be. But what about new players specifically? We are told by the concerned trolls that new players' incomes are made primarily by selling materials, and this is a matter of common sense that, quote-unquote, everyone knows. Is that correct, though? No, it is not. New players' net worth and account value may be mostly materials, but the gold in their wallets is not. One need only observe the gameplay of new players to actually see this. Almost all new players open their loot bags and hit deposit all. They rarely actually sell their materials. It goes into their banks, out of sight, and out of mind. For brand new players, the overwhelming majority of gold in their wallets comes from selling rare and exotic drops, completing dailies for 2 gold per day, and silver from meta rewards and champ bags. Watch any stream of a new player and how they play, and you will see very quickly that I'm correct. As an aside, the fact that new players typically don't sell their materials hinders their early account progression. If they did sell their materials, they would find their progression significantly faster. Look at Mighty Teapot's Zero to Hero series. In that series, he levels a new account from scratch with no help from any outside account. He sells every material that drops, and his account progresses rapidly. So rapidly, in fact, that many of the YouTube commenters accuse him of cheating. They don't understand how he does a meta train and makes 80 gold while they only make 10. The difference is they deposit all their materials. He sells all of his materials. continuing along regarding new players, the idea that new players are primarily sellers and thus in the hurt camp, while veterans are primarily buyers and in the benefit camp is ridiculous. In addition to the reasons I've already discussed, I reject the notion that new players are primarily sellers. No. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite. New players need stuff. They need a full exotic set of gear with runes and sigils. They need 20 sop bags. They need to obtain ascended gear. They need agony resistance infusions. Their demand for items is greater than their income. What does that mean? Well, it means that they likely spend every gold they acquire. So even if they sold every material that dropped, they would still be 50-50 split between being a buyer and being a seller. But in fact, they are more likely skewed towards being a buyer, if anything, as a result that the new player arguably benefits from lower material prices inordinately. As a result, they are more likely in the buyer camp. But no, Nike, you say. New players, they buy their Davona Berserker armor sets from the trading post, and they buy named, dropped exotic weapons. They don't craft these items. I will give you credit for being partially correct on that. These are not, in fact, crafted items and are, quite a bit cheaper than crafted items. But their prices are still controlled by the prices of materials despite being dropped items. How can that be? At the absolute lowest end, totally valueless exotics are always going to be worth about 2 ectoplasms from salvaging. Thus, the price can never drop below the price of 2 ectos. So even if 10,000 Davona armor sets dropped immediately and were sold, it wouldn't drop the price below this hard floor. And make no mistake, the ectoplasm market is huge. 20,000 ectos being added to the market for sale at any single moment would have a tiny effect on the price of ecto, almost none. As far as weapons go, at the low end, they are bounded by the ecto salvage rate, but also by the precursor forging RNG rate, which is why weapons tend to have a slightly higher value than the cheapest armors. So what point am I working towards? Namely this. If even dropped exotic prices are controlled by the materials market, and the materials market as a whole declines in price, it makes the dropped exotic armors that players actually want for their builds easier to acquire. This means, of course, that new players benefit from the price drop of materials too. And since your first set of exotic gear is perhaps the single most important item for your progression in game, this makes the benefit for new players inordinately higher than it would be for the general game population. And again, I must remind you, the drop of materials prices, especially ectoplasms, has nothing to do with AFK farmers. So even if we could conclude that dropping material prices was somehow harmful to new players, which I've just proven is not correct, it still has nothing to say about AFK farmers, because the items that AFK farmers are limited by are typically T6 materials and ectoplasms, which the AFK farmers are not farming. There is, however, a group of players I can identify who are unambiguously harmed by AFK bots. And that is real players whose gameplay loop is similar to AFK bots. You see, most players play a variety of content. Even PvE-only players play a fairly wide variety, and thus they receive a variety of rewards. Dozens of kinds of materials, un-ID'd loot bags, liquid gold, map-specific currencies, tokens, and exotic and rare drops. Their income comes from a robust basket of goods and not any specific niche item. Thus, they are largely immune to price drops of any single item affecting their gold per hour. But AFK bots and players who play like AFK bots do have a narrow niche of farming targets. If your entire gameplay loop as an active player consists of killing level 55 Grawl in the open world for hours on end, all day, every day, I will admit you will likely be hurt by AFK farmers. That said, I don't feel bad for you in the slightest, because frankly, I don't even feel like you exist. the amount of active players whose gameplay loop mimics a bot may in fact be 0. And if their number is greater than 0, I'm sorry, ANET didn't design the game with players who roam around killing open world monsters in a small area in order to target farm a specific material. They clearly intended players to take part in meta event chains, world bosses, and instance content at endgame. If your gameplay loop can be replicated by an AFK bot, you have to question the value of your gameplay in the first place. Now, this might sound harsh and even insulting, but remember, I don't think that this player that I'm talking to even exists. So if I am being harsh, I'm being harsh to someone who doesn't exist. So in conclusion, economically, I agree that AFK farmers are a bad look for the game, and ANET should consider taking action against them for that purpose. But it's not critical, as they are a relatively minor and trivial problem, even in the context of perception of the game. Things like the UI that needs overhaul and the Zaitan fight are something that is significantly worse for the perception of the game than AFK farmers, to cite just a few examples. As far as economic impact, my conclusion, as you have heard, is that AFK farmers are both negligible and also not damaging to the economy. I've made my case as strong as I could, and I'm very confident that while I may not be 100% right on every assumption, I believe my estimate of the numbers aren't far off, and also that the case I made regarding both macro and microeconomic impact from a theoretical and philosophical standpoint would largely be agreed with by anyone with a real understanding of the game's economy. Thank you guys for watching. I'm sure you'll have some comments, so please leave them below. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll see you next time.